The words of our youth ring loudly on this day. Today, we are also doing an advanced commemoration of the United Nations International Day for the World's Indigenous People on August 9th. And so the words of the youth are important. The struggle to find meaning and wisdom in a world run rampant challenges their faith in us, their faith in our stewardship of their inheritance. But rather than throwing up her hands in defeat, Greta Thunberg challenges us to make ourselves relevant to the struggles at hand. While the world literally burns, she takes that one drop of water and continues the work of dousing the flames, recognizing the world's imbalance and naming our part in it, doing the work that needs to be done, no matter how difficult. And it is not easy. Her worry is the worry of many young people, too young to vote, too young to lead, and yet lead they must. In the absence of leadership from their elders, like the elephant, the tiger, the beaver, and the bear, the leaders have vacated the position of authority and judgment and created a leadership vacuum. And so this generation steps up against insurmountable odds as a hummingbird goes about its task because it is right. I remember the words of Barack Obama in the wake of the Parkland shooting in February 2018 as young people from the school called for gun control. He said, "Young people have helped lead all of our great movements. How inspiring to see it again in so many smart, fearless students, standing up for their right to be safe, marching and organizing to remake the world as it should be. We've been waiting for you, and we've got your backs. We've got your backs." That is the sentiment we don't often hear these days. Just as the hummingbird in our story struggles to do the right thing against all odds and working against time, so too did the Parkland kids take on the task of fighting for what they believed in, just as Greta Thunberg is doing. And I have to ask, do we have their backs? The bear and the beaver and all the other animals turn and run when the fire engulfs the forest. When things seem most intolerant and hopeless, where are the voices of our generation that steady us while the fire rages and bring us back to our commitments and our purpose in this society? Often we do not have the difficult conversations because it comes at a price. Or do we just watch the hummingbird as it does its work, or do we join in to help? I remember the video that I watched this past summer while attending the summer's program at the Vancouver School of Theology. We watched a video called Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, about a school teacher, Jane Elliott, who conducted an experiment to confront racism on a frontline documentary called A Class Divided. In the video, the teacher segregated kids out based on their eye color, and each was afforded additional rights or penalties based on their eye color. Sometimes the blue eyes kids had it better, and the next day the script was flipped, and the brown eyed kids were on top. It was a powerful reminder of how racism works, how privilege works, how power works. We don't usually understand it until we are living in it. Afterwards, years later, the children came back as adults to report that the experiment continued to adjust their views about race and privilege, about understanding others and othering, and helping them to see points of view beyond their own. In that same film, the same experiment was used with corrections officers. And while many felt uncomfortable being told that their faults were indicative of their designated group, when they spoke up in protest, they often did so alone. The rest of the group held back, silent, waiting to see the fate of the one who stood up for themselves, when in reality, that person was really standing up for everyone. Jane Elliott even asked the group during the debrief, why they did that, why they stood back. Many could not elucidate why they remained silent. But in that example, they began to understand how power and authority work to hold sway over us, beyond the things we see and hear. And so, like the bear and the beaver, they accepted the ruin of the world over the impulse to do what the hummingbird was doing. In so many examples, we do this. We know what is right, what needs to be done, but often we refrain from doing it, abandoning those doing the work to burn themselves out, trying to do the right thing while we judge the result and whether it is worth our effort. I was reminded of the parable of the Good Samaritan here. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, it says, "On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he asked, 'what must we do to inherit eternal life?' 'What is written in the law?' he replied. 'How do you read it?' He answered, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.' 'You have answered correctly,' Jesus replied. 'Do this, and you will live.' But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?' In reply, Jesus said, 'A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going by the same road and saw the man. He passed by on the other side. So too a Levite. He came to the place and saw him and passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He took him and bandaged him his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, then put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him. When I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of the robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The man who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." The expert in the law questions Jesus, knows what needs to be done. Love God and love your neighbor. But which neighbor? He asks. This falls into a long line of rulemaking around who is worthy of our effort, who is blessed among our community. Jesus' answer is simple. The neighbor, Jesus points out, is all who struggle, all who share space, all who have need in this world, from the lowly downtrodden to the abused, to the one who has nothing. Reach out and give all you can. Help where you can. Support and have mercy. The neighbor is everyone. And in his instruction on how to be a good neighbor, Jesus says, "Go and do likewise, to be a good neighbor to humankind." This we know, yet how often do we lean into the struggles of another to really say we have lived out Christ's calling in us? How often do we take the step to be visible and intentional when we see the world is struggling, when we see people are hurting, when we know our voice is needed? Tuk Dia does the work and says, "I am doing what I can." This is no different from the struggles we see in our youth today. While many have been turned off and tuned out in video games or the latest app as a distraction, still others like Greta have found their voice to speak for a generation of young people who will inherit the world long after we are gone. Greta Thunberg is leaning in to say, "I'm doing what I can." Are we? Beyond living environmentally, making considerate choices, and acting responsibly individually, are we giving the environmental crisis the necessary attention, support, and consideration it deserves? We are making the decision not just for ourselves, but for all who will come after us. It is lonely to do this work alone, as we see in today's story. But with the efforts of the beaver, the bear, the elephant, and the tiger, even an insurmountable fire becomes manageable if we work together to solve problems. This is the purview of togetherness, of community, and it is an old Indigenous teaching that our elders still instill in us, to care for one another. And so we take a moment to commemorate the wisdom and legacy of Indigenous people through history and story, to acknowledge the International Day of World's Indigenous People coming up on August 9th. I will be in Rama, Ontario on August 9th, taking part in the United Church National Indigenous Gathering, which I think is fitting to be commemorating our practice in relation to our Christian teachings. In our traditional teachings, it is often said we plan ahead about the seventh generation ahead of us. And as we do so, remember today that we live in a troubling world, a world full of strife and conflict, full of hate, that Indigenous people have often been the witness to as a canary in the coal mine. I think about the reservation system and the Indian Act being forerunners of the apartheid system in South Africa, that segregationists came here to learn how Canada was treating its Indigenous people in order to model a system of separation for African people and their colonizers. I think about the abuses in the church and the residential school system that affected many generations of Indigenous people, and how the ongoing physical, sexual, and psychological abuses that have come into light in so many congregations and denominations were not so foreign to my ancestors, many of whom struggled to live in the aftermath of those families through addiction, opioid misuse, drug and alcohol addiction, depression, and mental health issues that afflict many in the mainstream today. And while we have witnessed much, we as Indigenous people have never been broken. Our collectivity and belief in the traditional teachings of our elders has never been more vital and more needed. This core of our understanding differentiates us from our contemporaries because we are interconnected between family and place, between hierarchy and decentralization, between peoples and their neighbors. It is our job to take care for all as stewards and wisdom keepers. And so Dukdukdea is a good role model, simple and free, dedicated to purpose and encouragement for others. In the 1970s, our elders in the Indian Ecumenical Conference at Morley began to say that there will be a time and a place when we will begin to share our wisdom because it is needed in creation. And like Dukdukdea, we are doing what we can. In spite of that history, we know we can do better. And I am reminded of the Declaration of Interdependence written by David Suzuki in 1992 for the UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The declaration reads in part, "We are the earth through plants and animals that nourish us. We are the rains and the oceans that flow through our veins. We are the breath and the forests of the land and the plants of the sea. We are the human animals related to all life as descendants of the firstborn cell. We are with these kin in a common history written in our genes. We share a common present filled with uncertainty, and we share a common future as yet untold." And it concludes with this: we believe we are one brief generation in a long march of time. The future is not ours to erase. So where knowledge is limited, we will remember all those who will walk after us and err on the side of caution. This we resolve, that all this that we know and believe must now become the foundation of the way we live. At this turning point in our relationship with Earth, we work for an evolution from dominance to partnership, from fragmentation to connection, from insecurity to interdependence. The journey of the Hummingbird is one of faith, faith that sustains, faith that abides, faith that is more than words, because it is lived in actions and deeds. As our neighbors in the South in America deal with the terrible loss of life in detention facilities, in the streets, and at the shopping malls, while the abject hatred seems to be festering in the body politic down there, we give thanks for the peace and we enjoy here. Not a perfect peace, but peace that is manageable for now. It is a peace that I have noted before that comes at the expense of Indigenous people, their rights, and the rights to their land. Though we have peace through treaty, we still see injustice. We still see inequality. We still see struggle. May we have the wisdom to choose a path toward a future that helps us to work together, to live into the promise that we are doing all that we can. Amen.